thank you all for coming. And of course, thanks to our four panelists for coming to Duisburg from near and far. I will introduce you in a minute. Before that, I would really just like to take a moment to also contextualize our somewhat troubling topic for tonight, namely the relationship between populism and global cooperation. Governments crack and systems fall because unity is powerful. Lights go out, walls come tumbling down. That's the refrain of a song by the British band The Style Council, released in 1985. It was actually a protest song against Thatcherism, but it was in hindsight also interpreted as, in a way, a prediction of what was going to come, namely the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in fact, in the early 90s, there was, in a way, a widespread atmosphere and expectations that walls would become tumbling down everywhere. That we were somewhere going towards a borderless world. And some people were even envisioning something like a borderless prosperity coming along with it. Now, that hope hasn't materialized, certainly not for everyone in the same way. And on the contrary, it soon became visible that a lot of the problems that were emerging were actually a globalized form of marginalization and exclusion from democratic decision-making processes. Now, among the many reactions to this perception, there was one movement, namely the global justice movement, which developed somewhat a counter-motto, and that said another world is possible. Another world meaning not necessarily a less interconnected world, but one which would be less unjust and less undemocratic. Now today, we're in 2019, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Not everybody was aware of that. Apparently, the German Ministry of Interior had to file an emergency request to revise the federal budget because it had apparently forgotten to allocate the funds for the celebration of this anniversary. And maybe that is not entirely by chance. In fact, we now do have the impression that this idea of walls tumbling down is worlds apart. On the contrary, we have the impression that walls are being created everywhere, that they are built, that they are projected, that they are promised. The most notorious example, of course, being Donald Trump's project of a wall between the US and Mexico that will fend off any connection between the US and its southern border. And that wall is, in a way, a visualization of his motto, infamous campaign motto, America First, by which he meant, as he put it in his second speech to the UN General Assembly, that he and all his followers reject, quote unquote, the ideology of globalism and embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Now, patriotism or nationalism is, of course, associated at least automatically with the political right. But what we have seen in recent years is that also on certain strands of the left, instead of another world is possible, we have also a lot of references to the nation, to sovereignty, to borders, to identity. Now, what is that? It has been suggested that there is a very close connection with what we call populist politics and the rejection of globalization or global cooperation more specifically. So I'm not going to already talk about various definitions of populism, but just very, very roughly an emphasis on the differentiation between a somewhat uncorrupted people and a corrupted elite that is not representing that people. And there seems to be a relationship between that conviction and the rejection of globalization. And how exactly can we grasp this? This is one of the questions that I've asked our panelists to at least give in some initial answers to. But then also, why is it that this rejection of globalization and global cooperation is so appealing? So why is it gaining so much ground? Is it because it simply has the more appealing story? For example, make America great again. Does that mean that the idea that America was once great, whenever that was, and then somehow lost this greatness, and now we need some hero character to reestablish it? Maybe this is just so appealing, but maybe there are other reasons as well. And then finally, how should we position ourselves as academics, but maybe also as citizens? What is the correct analysis and then also positioning in this context? Now, these are some of the questions that we will be debating on this panel, and we said that everybody would have just a short input statement of 5 minutes, and we will then discuss on the panel and then open it up to the Q&A. So your questions you will have a chance to ask them. So let me introduce our 4 panelists before they get a chance to speak. Benjamin de Cleen is Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at Vrije University, Brussels. He has worked extensively on the discourse theoretical conceptualization of populism, nationalism, and conservatism, and on the relationship between these. He has also done empirical research on the Vlaamsbelang, the radical right-wing Flemish party. And he is the international chair of a research project named Desire, Center for Democracy, Signification and Resistance. Among the many publications that he has on the topic, I will just mention a special issue that he recently co-edited entitled Populism and Nationalism, Constructing and Representing the People as Underdog and Nation. So here we already have a clear reference to our topic today. Our second speaker is Daphne Halikiopoulou. Daphne is Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Reading in the UK. She has her research focuses on comparative European politics, far left and far right parties, as well as the cultural and economic determinants of far-right party support. Now, it's also here very, very hard to pick one publication, but I decided to mention that already in 2011 you co-edited a collected volume entitled, what was it entitled? Nationalism and Globalization, Conflicting or Complementary. So here also very much on the spot of what we're going to discuss tonight. And also I would like to mention that you also had an extensive project on the Golden Dawn Party in Greece and on its rise and the implication that that had for the Greek party system. Now to my left, Wolfram Kaiser. He is a professor of European Studies at the University of Portsmouth, which is, by the way, a partner city of Duisburg. Important. You focus very much on the history of European integration and the European Union, as well as the international relations of the EU, with a specific focus on the importance of narratives in the context of EU integration, European integration. And I decided to mention an edited volume that just came out entitled, co-edited with Richard McMahon, who's also in the audience, Transnational Actors and Stories of European Integration, Clash of Narratives. So here we also have reference to this, this idea that I mentioned before, that the story that is told about these questions of course matters. And so last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce my colleague Taylan Yildiz, who is a political scientist, research associate with the Institute for Political Science here at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and also associated with the NRW School of Governance, with which we are cooperating for this event. Taylan has done, I should say, some pioneering work in Germany, at least in applying narrative analysis to political questions, national and international politics. He has, for example, an edited volume with my other colleague, Frank Gardinger, entitled Political Narratives, Concepts, Analyses, and Research Strategies. And recently, if I understand correctly, you're also interested in what you call the metaphorical resources of authoritarianism, particularly with the focus on the developments in Turkey. So we see we have different disciplines, different regional focus, so let's see if we also have some controversy. So Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. I will time myself. You will see why that will be necessary, perhaps. So hi, thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. Beautiful room, beautiful light, no? Usually academic things are in terrible places with this above your head in a basement. This is beautiful, there are trees. Beautiful sunlight, so it's a much happier constellation than is typical, even though the topic is not so happy still. We can be in a nice place discussing it. So I want to start with a few brief conceptual remarks, because that's something I actually know something about. And also because I think that it might help, I hope it might help the discussion. Academics like concepts a little bit too much. This is a problem, so I will keep it brief, but I do think it might matter. And basically what I want to say is that in discussions of nationalism and populism and global cooperation and patriotism and so on, we have to be clear about what we mean by those different terms. So very basically I would like to say that contrary to what is often considered to be the case, nationalism or patriotism is not a part of populism necessarily, nor the other way around. These are two different things. They are very often, this is not my book, it's true. I have never published a book. Edited volumes, yes, but I've never written a book entirely. I suffered so much with the PhD book. I cannot do it. I have to first process this a little bit more. But, so my point is basically that contrary to how, especially journalists, but even academics often discuss populism and consider the rejection of migrants to be a part of populism, to nationalism is a part of populism, and there's a lot of conceptual overlap. And my point is basically that these things are empirically very closely connected very often. Many populists are nationalists, many nationalists are populists, and so on and so on. But we can only understand why that is such a strong combination by looking at it as a combination. That means these are two different things with different dynamics that work well together, but to understand those dynamics we need to consider them as two different things, basically. So I wrote some stuff about this, which basically argues that populism revolves around a vertical down-up axis between the powerless and the powerful, basically, whereas nationalism revolves around the representation of the nation as a group based on a shared territory, often also shared language, traditions that come with living on that territory. So this means you end up with quite a minimal definition of populism that basically says that populism is a discourse or a political logic, let's not go into that, that is based around the opposition between the people and the elite, with the people in a down position and the elite in the up position. So the people is a powerless, very large, powerless group on the bottom. The elite is a very powerful, illegitimately powerful group on the top, with the crucial problem, of course, being, according to populists, that the elite is disconnected from the people and does not represent them. So what populists do is say, look, we will represent the ordinary people, we will not be like the current elite, but when we are in power, we will actually represent the ordinary people. That's populism, nothing more. I think conceptually we need nothing more than that. Of course, you have very different populisms. You have left-wing populism, right-wing populism, sometimes even something that can be more center or right and left at the same time. But it means that populism can be very problematically racist, can be very left-wing, can be very right-wing, can be something in between. And so our normative evaluation of populism should also depend on what it is populists want to do with their power once they get it, of course. So it also means that populism is not inherently nationalist. It often is, and even the ones that aren't really nationalists still very often operate on national level, which is a different thing. But they are not the same. Nationalist politics is something else, because nationalism revolves around the claim to represent the nation, which is something very different than the people as an underdog. The nation is a much more often cultural or at least territorially bound group with a shared history, developed over time, shared language, shared traditions, shared norms and values, and so on and so on. That's nationalism. So this means that populism and nationalism are two very different things. You can be nationalist without being populist, you can be populist without being nationalist. And even when you are both, then you are combining two things that are not necessarily the same. You see this combination very often, of course. You see it on the radical right. I don't have to explain you how that works. Anti-migration positions combined with the claim to represent the ordinary people and so on. But also, and increasingly you see it on the left. You have Aufstehen in Germany. You have the Sozialistische Partei, the Socialist Party in the Netherlands. You have La France Insoumise in obviously France, otherwise they wouldn't be called that. But so my main argument is basically that yes, these things are very often very closely combined, but we need to look at them as a combination, and this is the key to understanding what's happening. So we need to understand why this speaking in the name of ordinary people works so well in combination with the claim to speak in the name of the nation, and why it's so difficult for people operating on a level above the nation to claim to represent ordinary people, which I think, if you look at the criticism of global cooperation, becomes a crucial question. I will end it there for now, I think. So.
Thank you very much. Daphne?
Excellent. I would like to also extend my thanks and say thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, Christine, for your really interesting introduction, because when you were talking about walls, all that I could think of was the Economist's cover, I don't know if you're familiar, with the new nationalism, which is precisely that. It's precisely the idea that, borders are important because actually there is a big tension between global cooperation on the one hand and actually preserving nationalism and national identity on the other. So, so what I would like to do, I've been asked to sort of stick to the questions, and I know I have 5 minutes. So I do both quantitative and qualitative research on far-right parties in many dimensions. So what I'm going to do here in the next 5 minutes is very briefly answer the 3 questions in your program by putting sort of different segments of my research together. So in a nutshell, the first question I want to answer is the why. Why are we witnessing the rise of the far right across Europe? And actually, which is a paradox, why after the economic crisis in Europe, which you would have expected that it would be far left parties appealing to people's economic considerations, they're not doing really well. It's actually the far right that is doing well. Why is that happening? The conventional wisdom in the field, for those familiar, is that it is a cultural backlash, that it's essentially this fear of erosion of our national identity that is driving this phenomenon. And we know this because immigration is now a very salient issue and is far more salient than the economy. I disagree with this thesis, and I argue that actually it is both at the demand side level, it is both cultural and economic considerations that both equally drive voters. Actually, immigration is erroneously associated to only culture. There's a lot of people who worry about immigrants as competitors in the labor market or worry about the provision of the collective goods of the state. So actually, both economy and culture drive far-right party support at the demand side level. And then there's also an important supply side story. We need to also look at what these parties are saying. We need to understand their political message. Why are they able to mobilize and to capitalize on certain insecurities in some countries, but not others, right? Surely there are economically and culturally insecure people in Portugal, yet there is no far-right party there. Surely there are economically and culturally insecure people in the Republic of Ireland, but there's also no far-right party there. This takes me to the second question: what is the role of nationalism? And my argument there is that the role of nationalism is actually in the supply. So it is not necessarily a demand, the new nationalism is not necessarily a demand side phenomenon, but what it is a supply side phenomenon. Benjamin did a wonderful job talking about nationalism, so I'm not going to make a conceptual argument here, but I will just give you a brief understanding of my definition of nationalism as sort of an ideology that feeds off a conflict line between the in-group and the out-group. What makes these parties successful is that they now utilize what I call a civic form of nationalism. In other words, they define the out-group, no longer in racial or ascriptive terms, such as previously extreme right parties used to do. They no longer say, we exclude the other because they're of a different blood or creed or origin or descent. We don't care about their color, but we care because their ideology is antithetical to our liberal democratic values. You see this very much with the AfD's campaign, the bikini posters, for example. We Germans, we need to wear our bikinis to go to the beach. Why are these Muslim fundamentalists telling us that we need to wear the burqa? If you look at Marine Le Pen's embracement of French republicanism and laïcité, actually she's contradicting she's excluding Muslims not on religious grounds, but actually on secular grounds, arguing that everybody in the French Republic must be secular, and these people, their values are actually antithetical to ours. Now, what this supply side, this political message is doing is that it is enabling these parties to extend beyond their secure voting base. So if traditionally it is the white angry men that vote for the far right, that is no longer the case, because these parties now appear legitimate with their moderate concerns over immigration, and many people who wouldn't otherwise vote for the racist parties now would vote for them. So now women vote for them, different age groups and different income groups also vote for them. So thirdly, to conclude with my third point, you had in your program, what about the counter-narratives? What should we do to address this phenomenon? Now, I hear two things from the scholarly community or even sort of journalists and academic friends. Either, or suggestion number one, we should also embrace anti-immigration policies, right? In order to defeat the far right, we must become the far right. And here we see the center right, but also interestingly the center and even the far left saying we should be more anti-immigrant because immigration sells. It's a salient issue. The second thing I hear is that what we need to do is embrace a powerful populism of the left. We need to appeal to people's emotions and use the populism narrative in a positive way. I am very cautious for both of these suggestions. And I would like to emphasize that. I'm more than happy to have a conversation about this. But I think the key issue here, and we're going back to the conceptual issue that you raised, is that populism may draw theoretically on democracy, but actually it is inherently in practice antithetical to democracy. Brexit is an excellent example of this. Populism is antithetical to democracy because at the end of the day it opposes every single institution or process that we have in a liberal democratic system to preserve the checks and balances of our democracy. If we go along the populist lines, I think we risk the stability and prosperity of our democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You go right to the other side of the table.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here today. I think I'm here basically because you want me to put on the hat of a historian in order to make this a bit more interdisciplinary, perhaps in terms of perspectives that we provide on the topic. And I would like to try and do this in the way in which perhaps Hans-Dietrich Genscher would have dealt with questions. So I'm a bit selective about the questions that you've posed for us, and I'm just going to concentrate on the second and the third and not the first one, as you've only given us 5 minutes. Now, the first one was what drives populist politics. How is this appeal best understood? And I'm very skeptical as a historian here on this panel of the more traditional progressive, if you like, social scientific explanation which focuses on socio-economic factors. We are actually seeing globally nowadays, as far as I'm informed, a closure to some extent of the income and wealth gap, and I'm talking about this in a global context. There's less inequality according to many standards globally in the developing world, particularly than there was 20 or 40 years ago. The indicators in any case at least mix, so I don't really think that this is necessarily in a contemporary perspective a sufficient or very good answer to the problem of populism. When we look at want to take a historical comparator, while I understand that there are differences between nationalism and populism de facto, I think it's often the same thing. In history, of course, when we go back, it would be useful, I think, to look at the period, what historians often describe as the first phase of globalization before the First World War, because I see many parallels with what we're going through at the moment. And here, what I think you saw in the late 19th century and early 20th century was, again, that many socioeconomic indicators, not just for Europe, but also for many other parts of the world, actually indicated that things were getting better. Better health provision, for example, sharply rising life expectancy, sharp reductions in extreme poverty in industrialized city or industrializing cities, but also in rural populations. And that's not true just for most parts of Europe and the United States or North America, but even for countries like Japan or Siam or others that in this period of colonization and colonialism remained independent. We are also talking about a period like nowadays, or at least in the period after the 1970s or from the 1970s onwards, of politics of greater pluralism in those days, obviously, and increased political participation, parliamentarization, and to some extent even democratization of political systems of existing constitutional monarchy. So greater opportunity for political engagement for people of different social backgrounds as well. Nevertheless, this is also a period of the rise of extreme forms of nationalism, racism, social Darwinism, and thinking about the global environment of international politics as a kind of zero-sum game. So you can only gain as a state at the expense of your neighbor. that, of course, was part and parcel of this entire radicalization in international politics that eventually led to the outbreak of the First World War. So why was that? And I think for that I would like to refer to the work of a German historian from the University of Bielefeld, who some, I think 8 years ago or so, wrote a very interesting book about this period as an age of nervousness, directly translated into English. Can't remember what the English version was called, or age of anxiety would probably be a better term in English. And here the key argument was that individuals and also collective groups, social groups and states increasingly feared future decline and disintegration, that they were concerned about insecurity, growing insecurity in a very rapidly changing world. And I think that's something that is also quite similar, I think, where I see similarities to the present day developments. Now, what were these insecurities in those days, or fears for the future related, for example, to demography? You have these debates in France in relation to Germany, in Germany in relation to Russia, and so on. Population grows, and then these other countries will eventually be superior to us economically, militarily, etc. Economically, fears of decline in the United Kingdom, for example, in relation to Germany, but also, if you look at it in a global perspective, fears in what we would now call the Western world or the Atlantic world, in North America, in Europe, particularly in Protestant countries, Anglo-Saxon countries, and Germany particularly, cultural and civilizational fears of decline, the Yellow Peril debate, late 19th century, early 20th century, about the future rise of Asia, for example, comes into this as well. So I think nationalism in this period, extreme forms of nationalism, could feed on anxieties about the future and insecurity, feelings of insecurity. And this is something where I see a strong parallel with present-day developments. For example, this recent global survey that looked at the question of how people across the globe look into the future found that in many developing countries, I'll just give you the example of India, where it was 72%, there's a great degree of optimism about future developments, and in Europe there's a huge amount of anxiety, particularly in countries that are extremely rich. One of the most anxious countries is also one of the happiest and richest countries in the world at this point in time, which is Denmark. Of course, Germans have always been very anxious, so we are quite high up there as well. And I think this is only to be explained with collective expectations of future developments, not of the current situation. And this is something that I think populists can feed on. I would very quickly like to make a few remarks on the third question, which was about should we actually develop emotive narratives or more emotive narratives of global cooperation, which we are or you are interested in the context of your institute or center, of course. And here I would say, being based at the British University, my university would now expect me to say, well, as long as I find someone who pays me for that, I will, of course, do that. But seriously, it is definitely the case from a more analytical perspective that narratives of cooperation or integration require some kind of emotional appeal in order to be potentially effective politically. And I think when you look, and that's my main area of research, at the history of European integration and cooperation in this transnational European context, then you definitely find that notions of European integration as a guarantee for a move from a situation of recurrent war to a situation of apparently permanent peace in the context of the European Union nowadays. Notions of friendship, which are very strong at the bilateral level between France and Germany, that need to be revived, cultivated, etc. And notions of shared values and norms that the EU has, of course, been developing over the last 50 years, but really concentrated on promoting more in the last 20 years or so, and that are also embedded in the European Union's constitution. All of these together, I think, facilitate narrative constructions of institutionalized cooperation for the common good, to quote Jean Monnet in this context, to make policy in the interest of all, independent of their nationality, ethnic background, or whatever. And I think this means that despite everything, the crisis in the European Union, Brexit, and so on and so forth, European integration in the EU is actually still quite resilient, because it can draw on these emotive connotations in terms of narrating its own history and its own existence. And it allows the search for common language and also combines a shared symbolic repertoire, the flag, etc., of course, which strengthens forms of cohesion in a transnational context. A purely functional, my last point, purely functional legitimation of forms of cooperation at European, regional or global level, in contrast, I think is doomed in the long run in any case. And I think the Brexit referendum is a very good example of that, because here we are talking about a member state of the European Union which has had a political elite across the party spectrum of the two larger parties for 50 years failed to make an emotive argument for membership in the European Union. It was entirely based on material benefits of membership, and of course the Remain side made this exceptionally conservative argument that it would be worse economically to leave the European Union than staying in, which was entirely defensive and functional, and which failed as a result. I think, I'm actually surprised in retrospect that 48% of the British people still bother to vote in favor of staying in the European Union, despite of the fact that there was no good argument for staying in the European Union. So my last point is that for the global level, however, this might mean that we have serious problems, because international organizations for the moment don't manage to actually garner this kind of emotive language and support for global cooperation, which I do see to some extent at the level of the European Union.
Thank you very much. Taylan.
Thank you for your invitation from my side too. Good evening, everyone. I will shortly share with you two narrative impressions on the topic. I'm not quite sure if I have some answers to your questions, but let me try. My first impression is related to the academic narration of populism, and I will argue that populism has changed its place in the epistemic organization of knowledge. My second impression is about populism in itself. Populism, in my opinion, is not a technique, as many argue. It rather is a substance that became attractive by narrative techniques. Yeah. These are big impressions, and I'm doomed to fail, obviously, but I hope it will trigger some interesting discussions here. So my conceptual thinking revolves on the view that narration is essential in the organization of knowledge. I think that is true for everyday life as well as for the sciences, even the hard sciences. Robert Schiller made this argument. A Nobel Prize-winning winner is currently writing a book on narrative economics and following the idea that history is driven by narration instead of rational decision-making procedures or institutional dynamics. But what is a narrative? Generally spoken, a narrative is a cultural phenomenon that embraces storytelling activities or practices. There are different types of practices, like the use of metaphors or the construction of roles, yeah. But I think the most important storytelling practice is implotment, yeah, the temporal sequencing of events, yeah, fictional as well as non-fictional or real-world events, yeah. Every story has a beginning and an ending. Implotment is the activity that connects both, the beginning with an ending, but always with the perspective of something happening in the middle, of something worth of being told. Yeah. So what happened to the social sciences that they engage so much in discourses on populism nowadays? Yeah. An obvious answer might be just because populists came into power, or at least became powerful actors in Western parliaments. Yeah. But when we look from the perspective of narratology, the answer would be slightly different. Yeah. We would argue that populism has changed its temporality. Yeah. It moved from the past into the future horizon, from something that seemed to disappear in the fog of history to something rising in the most developed areas of the world. And as I see it, there are maybe two different ways to narrate that shift. Some would say it is a kind of relapse in democratic governance, a withdrawal of electoral parts from the path of modernization or rationalization. Others would argue, more post-structuralist authors would argue that populism follows the liquidity of modernity, of the modernism, or follows the ambivalences of democratic governance in more general. Yeah. I think we should be very careful of causal explanations, because simply spoken, there is no prime mover that brings up populism in modern world. Yeah, such a view would only strengthen the divides populism relies on. Yeah, between the urban and the rural, the enlightened and the misguised, the educated and the illiterate, the poor and the rich, and so on. We rather should focus on the narrative modes of populism and the question on how it allocates truth and mobilizes social support. Now let me come to my second impression. It would be misleading to say that nobody is dealing with the question on how populism works through narratives, especially regarding rightist populism nowadays. But I want to make a critical point here. Many researchers regard populism as a mobilizing technique. Yeah? They focus on the activities of counter-elites and how they engage with populist discourses when they talk about we and them, when they use metaphors that reinforce such divisions, or when they construct all the gender constructions or talk about traders or stuff like that, just because such things are easy to tell and easy to understand. But I think the technical or mobilizing aspect of lies not in populism in itself and the simplicity of its arguments. The technical aspect that makes populism attractive seems to stem from the power of narration. Populism in itself is a substance, in my opinion at least. In the case of rightist populism, I would say it is a defensive form of cultural racism. In the leftist case, it is the concept of exploitation, and just because exploitation as a concept is prone of becoming captured by rightist narrations, we face a liminal zone where the distinction of left and right populism is very blurred. So that's all I have to say for the moment right now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to all of you for those spotlights. A lot of ideas out there, a lot of theses. Since we also want to keep enough time for the Q&A session, I would maybe suggest to get back to, well, I would say all the three questions, but maybe where we find maybe conversion and where we do see differences emerging here. So the convergence, I think everybody agrees that there is not a simple, well, it's always easy to agree that things are not simple, but that it's not a simple equation that, economic crisis or unemployment and so on will trigger different varieties of populism. That something else has to come there, but what exactly that is and what accounts for the differences between varieties of populism, maybe that's also a commonality. Everybody has spoken about different forms, different varieties of populism, but what exactly it is that leads to those varieties, there's maybe some difference here, and then also the question: is there really a contrast between populism on the right and populism on the left? Not so much in general, but also concerning this question of global cooperation, right? As we said, there are a lot of actors or protagonists in left-wing populism who then have arguments that are similar. And here I would maybe like to press you a little bit more and defend your point if you think they actually converge or have a zone in which they overlap, in which they become equally dangerous, or if you would defend the point that they're actually qualitatively different and that we should emphasize this difference. Anybody who would like to start?
I can start if you want.
Yes.
Okay. First, I would like to have to make a little disclaimer about the term populism, since we're going conceptual here. I think the term populism is extremely problematic. And that is because I think it is a tautology. There is no party in a democracy that doesn't talk about the people. It is not possible to find a party that doesn't somehow draw on some form of the people. Therefore, by definition, that's what we call the thin populism, right? So therefore, scholars say, oh, right, then we need to give it a thicker definition, nationalism. Okay, and then we identify the parties not because of their populism, but because of their nationalism, right? So there you go. Firstly, it is deeply problematic. So to answer, to go exactly to your question and say, well, are they the same or are they different? I would say that they are in many ways the same, not necessarily because of their populism, but because of their extremism. So if you are on extremist parts on the two extremes of the political spectrum, then yes, you have a similarity that you oppose in some way democracy. Now, if we then were to accept that populism is a useful concept, I would urge to look at William Riker's definition, which for some reason not many scholars actually look at, who focuses on populism as basically as a movement from below, because it is essentially it is the ideology that claims that the will of the people is not only the only way to go about it, but also the morally legitimate way to go about it. So if we then accept that the will of the people is paramount, and if you then want to translate the will of the people in terms of policy, then some of the people becomes all the people, right? You talked about the referendum. But these are big claims for a 52 versus 48%. The 52% became all the people. This is why populism is inherently antithetical to democracy, because essentially it translates part of the people to all the people and then makes the claim that it is morally superior and legitimate to translate the will of some of the people and make it into irrevocable and irreversible policy. So whether you believe populism is not useful and you look at extremes, yes, I believe that they are similar, the left and the right, or whether you believe that populism is useful, again, I believe they are similar in that they are against liberal democratic institutions. Thank you.
Counter-narrative, counter-positions.
We are only allowed to speak if we have a direct counter-narrative. I would just like to make the point that maybe we can get away, because I think this is plagues much of the discussion about populist political parties, is that we tend to have an essentialist notion of what constitutes a populist party. And why don't we just look empirically at the question of who votes for these political parties? If you take an electoral politics perspective, I think it becomes clear very quickly that for many voters there isn't much of a difference, because they can actually move from a left-wing populist party to a right-wing populist party and the other way around. And we are already experiencing political systems across Europe where we have political parties that actually try to integrate the traditional appeals of radical left-wing political parties of kind of social populism with nationalist discourses or discourses based on traditional cultural values or family values. We had this discussion a minute ago on the bus, I think, in the context, on the margins of our workshop about counter-narratives of European integration. The Polish case, I think maybe you want to come in later, is perhaps a very good example where Rafał Riedl suggested, well, actually peace in Poland is probably exactly that. It's a left-wing populist political party because it has a program of social populism, but at the same time it's also heavily nationalistic, Catholic, traditionalist, etc. So it's trying to integrate this. But in terms of electoral politics, we can definitely see that that populist parties, as in the case of this Brexit referendum, UKIP is a wonderful example of this, can draw on support from the left and right as a populist political party.
Yeah. I'm thinking. I don't agree, I think. I think there are very good points here, but I think that a bit more nuance about left and right populism, I think, is also in place. I don't think you can compare Podemos to the Vlaams Belang or AfD. I think you can say that they are both populist, that there is a degree of risk towards authoritarianism in the claim to speak for the people, sure. But I don't think that an inclusionary, socially progressive party that is pro-gender rights and pro-migrants' rights and pro-protecting refugees and so on can be compared to basically racists. I think this horseshoe theory in that sense is very, very problematic. And I also think that certain parties that are in the supposed political center are in that sense at least equally problematic in implementing policies that come directly from the radical right almost, or at least just repeating their discourses. If you look at the governments that govern with basically far-right parties in Austria and elsewhere, I think these parties that are in the supposed liberal democratic center are in that sense at least as problematic or even more. Which is not to say that there is no tendency in populism to, especially populism in power, to have authoritarian tendencies. I think there is always a risk there. But saying that these things are basically the same, I would strongly disagree with that.
Would you like to?
Yeah, maybe short. There are some similarities what narrative techniques belongs, but in substance, I think there's a big difference. But my point of view was how to narrate populism and how populism narrates itself. And I think to call that phenomenon what we observe, populism is a narration in itself. So I wonder myself why we call it populism. I remember I started studying politics in '94 in a department where people researched on Latin American politics, and we were told that populism is restricted to developing areas, to something what would be overcome in the path of modernization and stuff like that. And I was always wondering with this kind of arguments. In these arguments, there was no place for populism in Western societies. It was nearly inexistent here. Yeah? From my own experience living as a member of, as a part of a Western society, maybe more like minority parts, it was difficult to understand why populism is something restricted to Latin America, maybe Sub-Sahara or Asia. So it was always there. But now we observe something on the level of party politics, and we give it a name, populism. I think we named it populism because it's an easy narration and handsome word for what we observe. Yeah? Maybe there's much more things like when we read about Stuart Hall's book on cultural racism, and many similarities in that, and why we don't call it racism in the case of rightist populism. But I think the in between there are a lot of narrative techniques that come to work that maybe make some similarities to other political arguments who want to mobilize support.
Yeah, very interesting. I think we are constantly trying also to go to that reflexive level, right? So what are we doing at the moment? Which terms are we using? Are we actually contributing to a hype? I think in one of your papers I found this expression of the populist hype. And is there even something emotionally gratifying in talking about populism and taking the stance of the anti-populist, and thereby, of course, also gesturing toward the others, the populists, those who are driven by their emotions, and so on. But at the same time, we're trying to understand that, and that's hard without talking about it. So I'm wondering specifically, maybe to come back to that relationship between populist politics and say anti-globalization and anti-global cooperation. Is there something specific about populist politics which has to do with notions of exclusion? So you were talking about this anxiety. I think this resonates with an expression that has been made by German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. He said that according to him, Pegida, but it can probably also be applied to other movements as well, is the attempt of a sclerotic society to keep the world at bay. So the idea is keep everything out, keep out the migrants, keep out the treaties, the politics coming from without. Let's protect our space, which is the house, the family, the village, the city, and ultimately the nation, without against anything that's intruding from without. So my question would then be, would you agree that this features into both left-wing and right-wing varieties of populism? Is there something appealing to that? And would that maybe also be a way of coming to terms with that nervousness or anxiety that we were speaking about?
Yeah. I think there's something very interesting in the question there, this idea of keeping things at bay. And that also connects to what Taylan was saying about this populism narrative having become a very dominant narrative from the perspective, from academics, from journalists who are all the time talking about this. Which means that a lot of energy goes into that, and a lot of thinking follows that narrative, as if that's the right way of using the narrative, probably not. But anyway, a lot of thinking thinks, basically accepts the populist narrative and thinks with them. This is one thing, and also therefore confirms them. But it also means that a lot of energy goes there and doesn't go anywhere else. And for example, I think that the conservatism of the radical right, for example, is something that is often missed. And if you look at, you were saying the civic nationalism, for example, so the idea that we now have AfD or the Vlaams Belang protecting women's gender equality, protecting gay rights that they were the staunchest opponents of ever and still are. It's very interesting because if you have on a national level a debate about, let's say, gay abortion rights, they are against. But if it comes to opposing Islam, they are for. Because of course, what do we do now? Well, Islam is against this, Muslims are against this, so we are pro. We become the defenders of liberal democratic rights, and the next day or the same day at another meeting they are against. But what's very interesting there is if you look at the way they position themselves as the defender of the social order in both cases. Just what the social order is and what they are defending, that changes. But in the way they position themselves, the radical right has always presented itself as the defender of a social order that is being threatened and that will disappear or that will decay, which is a typical conservative position. So I would agree in that sense with my colleagues on the left there, not the political left necessarily, I don't know. But with your importance of narration, which shows that parties on the radical right are very capable of navigating extreme, sometimes contradictions in terms of content, based on a stable and in that sense coherent positioning that just depends on the context they are using. So, but it also connects to, if we think away from populism for a second, we might also start to see other things, that this constant blah 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 about populism can start to snow under to some extent.
Any other thoughts on?
Well, Christina, as you're pushing us so much to think about this left-right divide, I would like to take this up again because at least there seems to be some kind of potential for controversy there. Defender of social order. I would say, well, you see that with populist left-wing parties as well, for a different set of reasons. So, of course, you can differentiate between the left-wing populism, which says we want to protect the welfare state at the national level or at the European level in some form or shape, and you might say from a normative perspective, I like that more than a racist argument that we don't want the Polish plumber in Germany, for example, or in France for that matter. But ultimately, to the Polish plumber, as long as he's physically not harmed, both agree that the Polish plumber should stay in Poland. So the effect, I think, might well be the same. And I think when you're talking about global questions of global cooperation, where the threat is perceived and how the threat is perceived differs, obviously. So on the populist left, you would say, well, the threat is wage competition, for example, or the results of trade that lead to displacement of industrial production in a particular country into another part of the world, and this leads to unemployment and social problems, etc. So this could lead to social populism, but on the other hand, on the right, of course, you have more traditional culturalist or racialist arguments why you want to prevent migrants from coming to Europe or workers to move across borders, etc. But ultimately, I think the fears are roughly the same in terms of the effect they have on the policies that might be advocated by the populist left and the right. So differences in terms of their identity and their ideology, but the effects may well be congruent.
Would you like to comment?
Sure. Somewhere in the middle between you two, I think. So just conceptually to clarify something, I don't think that there is anything nationalist inherently in populism. There is, and that's directly an answer to your question, because you said, okay, is it, what did you say, antithetical, the global and the there's nothing like that in populism. Populism simply says the corrupt people, the good people against the corrupt elite. So we can't extrapolate any nationalist implication out of that. However, and here is where I disagree with you, I think that does not mean that far-left parties can't be nationalist. Actually, a lot of far-left parties are nationalist, and perhaps they put forward a very different type of nationalism to the exclusionary, sort of, very obvious one that the far-right does. But still, you have a lot of nationalism in, they are very anti-EU, usually the far-left, and they're anti-EU because they equate basically class with the nation, as opposed to equating some people with the nation. So I think nationalism is very, very well compatible with both the right and the left, and so in that respect, I will go even further than you and say that actually, not even in terms of policy, but even in the narrative, there are more similarities than we might initially appreciate or detect. But I don't think that these have anything to do with the classification of these parties as populist.
like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists for their great inputs and their great discussion, to thank all of you